Today's video is brought to you by OCALA LED lighting. You might think that you can see just fine at night. Well, I did too, until I did this little upgrade. As you can see from this footage, here is some before OCALA LED lighting, and here is some after OCALA LED lighting. The difference is amazing. With high brightness and easy installation, OCALA LED lighting is definitely the route for you. They're easy to install, and they're available for all makes and models. Click on the link in the description below and enter promo code 612motorsports at checkout to get yourself 15% off. Now back to our video. Hello and welcome back to another episode of 612 Motorsports. Today we are in OCALA, Florida at Big Daddy Don Garlits Drag Racing Museum. There's two buildings of amazing cars here, and I cannot wait to get in and check them out. But before we get inside, you know the routine. Go ahead and hit that subscription button, the notification bell, leave a comment, a thumbs up. All that stuff is super helpful. Follow along on Instagram if you're not. All that stuff, greatly appreciated. Now, let's get inside.
I'm Big Daddy Don Garlits, and welcome to the Museum of Drag Racing.
The drag strip, the king's domain where Big Daddy has ruled for over 30 years. And this is Donald Garlits with wife Pat at home.
Your life is not like anybody else's on or off the drag strip. We've seen that. And you're lucky to be alive.
That's right.
You're like the cat right there. You have more than 9 lives.
Let's go to some non-related racing incidents. And one I think about was Savannah, Georgia. And reading this in close calls, it almost looked like a comical situation. I mean, it's something that's serious at the time, then later on, well, we'll laugh about this 20 years from now. You're driving home, very dark night, and this before Interstate 95.
They're before interstates.
You're driving through the swamps of Georgia, and bam, your rear end at the time just broke, is that right? And you went off into a ditch.
The wheel broke at the axle and came off the truck, which meant there was no brakes because that let the brake shoes be exposed. And the truck, it was a GMC carryall, and it veered to the left and went down into a 30-foot canal full of water with the dragster on the back, on the trailer, open trailer. And we were carrying a spare engine behind the seat, behind the driver's seat, attached to that sheet metal floor with like 3/8 bolts. And we had a bunk up in the back, and Connie Swingle and his little boy, 6-year-old boy Teddy, were asleep in the bunk when this accident occurred. And within moments, we were in this water, and the only thing exposed on the truck was from the air trapped in it was a small area in the back where the slide open window is.
So now here you are in the ditch. You're pinned against the steering wheel. You can't move.
Yeah, because when the truck hit the water, you know, that's an impact of a cushiony type impact. But it tore that engine loose from the sheet metal floor, and it drove the seat forward off the runners. And of course, it's down on about a 30-degree angle, the nose of the truck, into the deeper part of the canal. So that meant that the weight of the engine, you got to remember, 392 engine, steel, is laying against the seat, and the seat's against me, got me pinned in between the dash and the seat on the driver's side.
And the water is rushing in.
It's gurgling in pretty fast.
And Connie gets out, pulls her son to the shore, swims to shore.
No. Connie opened the back window on the truck and threw his son out into the canal. Just out into the canal. And he knew he could swim. He had just learned to swim that summer, and he was hoping that he'd swim to the shore. We didn't know how far the shore was. It wasn't within, he couldn't walk. He did, in fact, have to swim. But then Swingle came back to get me, and he had to go underwater to push the seat forward and raise the weight of that 392 engine. That took superhuman strength, you can imagine. 30-degree angle, underwater, total darkness, working by voice and feel.
And right now the water's at your neck.
That's when I got free, the water was at my neck.
You miraculously get out. Dead silence, like the Titanic had just sunk.
Exactly, just a few bubbles were coming up.
15-mile walk into town.
Yeah, to Savannah.
Tow truck.
Yep.
The tow truck comes back. You find the spot after searching frantically.
Yeah, Swingle had to dive down in the water and find out, because we saw the marks coming off the road, but it was actually further down. It was almost like it hydroplaned on the canal a little while before it went in. So finally, after about a half an hour, Swingle has the tow rope attached to the front of the truck underwater. And so they placed the wrecker up crossways. It's on like a levee. And the wrecker's up on the levee, and it's jacking the rig out. And believe it or not, it wasn't hurt very bad. And it's pulling the whole thing up out of the canal, and it's just about up the bank, and the dragster's still on the trailer, and the trailer's still hooked to the car. It's all waterlogged, but it's still all there. And down the road, we hear this noise. It's a car coming at about 100 miles an hour. And Swingle and I run down the road toward it. We're waving our hands frantically, trying to get it to stop, because the wrecker is completely across the road. It is not even slowing this car down. It zooms by us, and Tommy Porter, who was at the controls of the wrecker running everything, sees it's going to hit him. So he releases the brake on the wrecker, and it rolls back, starts to roll back. The car sideswipes the front of the wrecker in the one lane. It's just a two-lane road. And of course, it hits the wrecker, and that disorientates Porter. He releases the brakes completely. The truck goes back down into the canal, and the big old wrecker goes right down on top of it all. Cruncho, everything is in the canal, and just the front of the wrecker stuck up out of the water now. And it's another 15-mile walk back to Savannah to get a big wrecker.
Now that sounds like a Keystone Cops
It was Keystone Cops, but I'll tell you what. The sad part about it was no insurance. The race car was our only means of income. We had no tow truck, no trailer, no race car. We were out of business. And the night before at Savannah, we just set the fastest and quickest time in the history of the sport. It just goes to show you how quick your life can change from a high to a super low.
It's drag racing's early days, and Don Garlits is the new hot shoe in the Southeast. The man from Tampa, nicknamed the Swamp Rat, is the terror of the drag strip, which in those days was usually an abandoned airstrip. It was the days of the slingshot dragster, a homemade car, basically frame rails, 4 tires, and a supercharged engine. The driver perched behind the nitromethane-fed power plant with his legs straddling the transmission and clutch. The long tube chassis had a straight front axle with the gas tank bolted on top and had to be push-started. It was a real crowd pleaser. Everyone came out to see the rails. The slingshots came in many different shapes and sizes. It was the rung what you brung era, anything goes. Drivers would be paired for eliminations, and the starter would wave a flag to start the race. The slingshots were very unpredictable. Wheel stands off the line to smoking the tires the entire length of the track. Drag racing, the all-American sport. These are the early years, the formative years, the run-what-you-brung era of the slingshot dragsters. And the name on everyone's lips is Big Daddy. Garlits writes history as he smashes every track record coast to coast and pioneers major innovations that transform the sport. A fire burnout, a showstopper, and a great way to heat the rear tires for better traction. Up to this time, in the late 50s, there had never been a fire or explosion in these cars, but as speeds increased, the danger grew closer. A driver's worst nightmare, the unforeseen enemy and killer of many drag racers, fire. The first recorded fire and explosion occurred in Chester, South Carolina in 1959 to none other than the Swamp Rat himself. Drivers had never worn anything but a plain shirt when they raced, but on that day, wife Pat had given Don a leather jacket, which ironically saved his life.
I had watched him in the T-shirt and just kept thinking that if anything ever did go wrong and he turned over, I used to think of you turning over in the car or something, how you just, your arms would just be ruined. And so I bought him the leather jacket, mainly as a protection for turning upside down.
Yeah,
or
skin abrasions.
Skin abrasions.
Not fire. No one ever, there'd never been a fire in drag racing. We had no idea such an enemy existed. I'd put a nice load of nitro in it and zipped off down through there, and just as I entered the traps, the blower backfired. I guess we floated a valve or something. Anyway, it backfired in the manifold, and I was just engulfed in these horrible hot flames, and they wouldn't go away. They just were there. I lapsed into semi-consciousness, and when I did that, my foot must have relaxed on the throttle, and when I did that, it shut the valve off.
Now, you had no gloves on at the time.
No
and
gloves
your hand
and
was
no
on the
face
left brake.
mask. I had on a special set of aviator goggles which saved my eyes. In the back of my mind, for some reason, I had always thought that burns like that would never heal, and I figured that I was probably going to die. I'd heard that from different people that, you know, when you're burned seriously like that, you know, you never heal and you die from blood poisoning, and that's all I kept thinking about. I've finally done something to myself that even though I'm alive right now, I may not survive. And little did I know that was very close to the truth. Yeah, they wanted to give me a shot to put me to sleep. I was in severe pain. I'm telling you, really pain, because my hands were burned, my face was burned, my arms, my legs. But I wanted to call my wife, Pat, because I really had a funny feeling that I might not make it. So I wanted to get her up there to Chester. So I told her over the phone that we'd had a little flash fire in the pits, nothing serious, but to get on a plane or a bus or train or something and get up to South Carolina. She was pregnant at the time, and so I didn't want to scare her real bad.
And I had no idea the seriousness of this accident. And there he was in bed. His nose was just black like a charred marshmallow, and he had tubes in his arms, and it was just terrible. It was a horrible shock.
Can you remember that like it was yesterday?
I sure can. And
what are the thoughts that went through your head?
Well, I hadn't expected anything that serious. I mean, I knew if he wanted me there that he had been burned, but I didn't dream that it was that bad. And then the head nurse, got me to the side, and she said, well, if he makes it the next 72 hours, everything's going to be all right. And so here we were now facing a life and death situation.
Yeah, I was, after being in that hospital a few weeks, the left hand, which had been burned so severely by being held on that brake handle, it didn't show signs of recovering, and it was already starting to draw up, like into a ball like that, and grow that way. And so the doctor said it would never be any good again, so he'd like to take that hand off because it looked like there was infection setting in. So he went to my wife and asked her to sign the operation release, and she wouldn't. My mother was there, and she wouldn't sign it, so they came to me, wanted to know what I wanted to do. And I said, I want to leave the hand on. I didn't care. That I would rather be dead than have my hand taken off. And at that point, I really meant it. And so the doctor says, you know, you're going to die, and I don't want you dying under my care, so you should find another hospital. And that in itself was a miracle, because we transferred then to Tampa. The first thing they did, the doctor came down and took a look at me, and they unbandaged my hands, and they were drawn up in the knots, and he just stretched the fingers right out straight, and just the blood just popped out of them, you know, because he just broke the skins. He wanted to get those joints limbered up. And so he put me in surgery the very next day, and scrubbed all that rotting flesh off, and kept my hands in a saline solution, then underwater, submerged, for another 4 or 5 weeks, and all the skin began to grow back. Wasn't that where you really contemplated once and for all giving up your career of drag racing? I had quit. I really had quit, and my brother was at the shop, running the shop, and he was selling the parts, the engines. All of the Chrysler engines were being sold to different people around the city, and of course that's when Art Malone came on the scene. Right, he walked into the hospital room, and he had never driven a dragster before, and he was very sympathetic to what went on. And he offered to drive your car, but you weren't too sure about that. Well, Art had only ever driven round-track cars, and I didn't know whether he could drive a fuel dragster or not. But I agreed to give him a try at it. He did seem sincere and aggressive and young and wanted to go places. So when we got out of the hospital, we rebuilt the Swamp Rat and had to change it around considerably because he was much taller than I was. And we took him over to Kissimmee, and it took to it like a duck to water. Within a couple of runs, Art was driving it just as good as anybody.
Garlits recovers from the Chester fire, and the very first time he gets back into the slingshot, tragedy strikes again.
We were getting footage and sounds for this movie that this guy wanted to produce. There was no ambulance, no insurance. We were kind of like partners in the track, so I could use it anytime I wanted to. And it kicked a rod out, and it was a bad oil fire, and it came up on the insides and burned my legs severely. Of course, I had gloves and jacket and face mask on, but I still got burned pretty good, some good 3rd degree. And I went to the hospital, and they doctored it all up, and I wouldn't take pain medicine because I'd had a lot of trouble with pain on the first time around. So the next morning, I got out of bed, and I'm getting ready to check out of the hospital, and the doctor says to me, he says, "What do you mean?" He says, "I haven't released you." He said, "You can't leave the hospital." I said, "Doctor, I've been through a major burn session." I said, "This is not near as serious as the last time." I said, "There's nothing more that you can do for me. This is just a healing process. I'll come in and see you once a week." He said, "If you leave this hospital, I won't be responsible for you." I said, "I don't think you're going to be responsible for me anyway. Goodbye." And so I went home and went back to the office to work.
Was it at this point where you just, that's it, goodbye, quit, I can't stand this anymore?
No, I went a little further than that.
Lions drag strip.
Lions drag strip, Long Beach, California. March 8th, 1970. The day that changed Don Garlits' life forever. Garlits, on the line in the final round, pops the clutch and the car explodes in a fireball.
Well, that was a terrible time, because just moments after that accident, as they took me out of the car, I saw my foot was blown away, and I had enough sense to know it wasn't anything magic going to be putting it back on there. It was severe pain, I mean excruciating pain beyond description. Just a very, very sickening feeling, a sinking feeling. You know, at that point I wondered if it was all worth it. And little did I know, you know, I figured my career was over, and all that I had done had brought me to this point. Now I was going to be a cripple for the rest of my life. And little did I know that it wasn't even the beginning of a career.
The pain was excruciating, but there was an incident, almost, it's like something out of a Laurel and Hardy movie. You were put in the ambulance, and what did the ambulance drivers do?
It was one of those funny swoop back old Cadillac type ambulances, you know, with the swoopy back section with the, you know, the door, the top of the door is way forward in the car. You know, it kind of leans like this. Well, when they pushed me up in there in that, what do you call them, the gunny or the stretcher thing on wheels, they didn't push it up in there far enough, and my foot was stuck up there in the door with this dangling piece. And everybody was in total chaos, you got to remember. A lot of people were on the starting line. People were screaming and hollering. There was somebody was screaming out of the stands. And they slammed the ambulance door on the remains of that foot that was still hanging by a couple of tendons. Still had some nerves hooked to it, I might add. And they had to open that door back up and release that piece and throw it inside with me. It was unbelievable.
Prior to that, though, let me tell you, the cars had gotten faster and faster, and the engines were in front of the driver, and constantly transmissions were exploding, clutches, oil fires in their face, and it was like they were riding on a time bomb set to go off, and you just didn't know when. And it was the scariest thing. It had, for a sport that had started out to be such a pleasure and so much fun, it had turned into a nightmare for me.
Look at the guys that got killed.
And so many of them had gotten killed.
Robinson, Sorokin,
Mulligan. And it was all from the same thing, from that engine being in front of that driver and causing all these things to happen, the explosions. So I lived in constant fear of the phone ringing on Sunday when I knew he was racing.
When you heard about that he lost his part of his right foot, what was that moment like?
The same as he said, just a very sinking feeling.
Because I told her over the phone that I'd lost my right foot.
So sad, and I just kept thinking, you know, why? Why is it worth all this?
This is one time that I didn't want to quit. I figured if I lived to survive this thing, I would extinct the slingshot dragster that had killed so many of my friends.
So you're in the hospital bed now, and the only thing you could think about is a design for a new dragster. You tried to keep it a secret, and when that word got out that you were designing a rear-engine dragster, all hell broke loose.
Well, yeah, they thought I was crazy. They figured I'd been hurt seriously. I'd lost my mind. My friends called me up and would tell me, didn't I know that every rear-engine dragster that ever been built turned right or left? In fact, I'd seen plenty of them turn right and left. Red Chase in 1957 at Houston almost ran over me with a rear-engine car. If I hadn't been so far in front of me, he would have crashed into me. They were not safe cars in that they didn't handle. They were safe cars for the driver. He had good visibility, but he couldn't drive the thing. There was not one rear-engine dragster ever built that went straight every run.
Well, what made you think that you could be the guy to do this?
I don't know. I just had a gut feeling that it could be done. That it looked to me like it was I had looked at some rear-engine cars that had been built, and I'd actually sat in them. And I just couldn't believe that anything that sat that nice and looked that good couldn't be made to handle. And plus, I had one other thing you got to remember. By this time, rear-engine cars had invaded Indianapolis, and they had said that no rear-engine car would ever get around the Indy 500, and yet the English built chassis that were able to do that. And I had that in the back of my head. I thought, if they can build a chassis go around the Indy 500, I ought to be able to build a chassis that can go in a straight line.
So now we're out of the hospital.
We're home
you're at
in
the
Seffner.
You're in Seffner, and you're at the drawing board with the rear-engine dragster.
I'm at the welder. I'm at the welder in my wheelchair. We're building the rear-engine dragster from the sketches that I had drawn in the hospital in Long Beach. And we actually have it setting on the ground now on 4 wheels, and it was a racy-looking thing. I'll never forget the first time I went and looked at it, walked in the shop, and there it was. And I got in it and sat in it, and it looked right. And I'll never forget, Swingle said, "It looks right, it must be right." And we couldn't wait to get to the drag strip with it. And boy, were we in for a surprise. The thing either turned right or left every time. And we went day after day to different drag strips. We went to Tampa Dragway. We went to St. Petersburg. We went to Orlando. We went everywhere. And it always did the same. It either turned right or left, didn't it?
It was an evil handling car.
We call it the evil handling little witch. And Swingle, he stuck by me. Tom Lemon stuck by me. They said, "We'll work on it, Big Daddy, as long as you think there's hope." And the phone would ring and they'd laugh. And I'll never forget it. I was at my lowest, and I was talking to Pat. I said, "I guess we ought to give up on the thing." I said, "Even though it seems like it's a safe car, as far as the driver safety is concerned," I said, "what good is it to be safe if you're going 215 miles an hour and the thing turns into the stands at the end?" I says, "That's not safe." I says, "Better take your chances with the clutches." And she says,
I have the quote right here.
"Go ahead."
She said, "Don, this is word for word now. Now we got to set the scene. You were very depressed."
Oh, I was ready. I was going to quit drag racing because I was not going to drive the slingshots anymore. My only hope to continue in the sport now was to have this rear-engine car where I could race. I never thought it would be a winner. I just hoped that it would be competitive and maybe I'd get in a win once in a while.
So at the lowest point where Pat really had you, I mean, she could have made you quit.
She could have finished me. Yes, right.
That could have been it right then and there. And she had survived the Chester fire and the Golden Triangle and all the other little things here and there. So this was her moment.
All she had to do was say, "You're right. It's not worth the effort. Hang it up. Let's open the speed shop." Well, we had the speed shop. We had the big High Performance World. She said, "Let's just go to High Performance World, draw our salaries out of the company, and that'll be it." She could have done that, but she didn't.
She turns to you and says, "Don, you know how I feel, but if you believe in that car, don't listen to anybody else but yourself. Just keep trying. If anybody in the world can do it, you'll find a way to work it out." Well, you know, I read that And I get chills right now when I think about
Well,
it.
I'm telling you, it brings tears to my eyes. I mean, I've heard that quote a dozen times, and I'm sorry, I apologize, but it tugs at my heartstrings because she's the reason that I'm still here, still getting it. And it's the truth. So we went back out, we took a fresh new look at it, Swingle and I, and then I have to give Swingle credit for something here. We come back, we went out again and then went over to Orlando, and the darn thing turned right or left. I don't know which way. It doesn't make any difference. It just, you go down the course and the car would make a little move and you'd pull the steering wheel and it would be too much. And so I told Swingle, we're riding back from Orlando, we're depressed again, and I said to Swingle, I said, you know, if I didn't know better, I think the steering was messed up. And he said, well, why do you say that? I said, well, you know, I can feel the car make a little move, and I go to correct it, and it's always too much. And Swingle says, well, why don't we slow the steering down? And I said back to him, I said, well, Swingle, it's got the same steering that the Slingshots had on it. It must be right. And he says, no, he says, that maybe that doesn't want the same kind of steering that the Slingshots have got. So we went back to the shop and changed the steering ratio and went back the next day to Orlando, and the car set the track record and went straight as an arrow. And that was it. It was over. Well, I had a bad experience with the Chester fire, and in getting off of the medication that they give you to ease the pain. In that particular case from Chester, it was mostly codeine. Well, they came with my actual shots after I came out of the operating room, and I mean, I guess they'd given me some stuff when I didn't know what I was taking, but by the time that I regained my sense about me, they came with my pain medicine, and I didn't want to take it. So they sent the doctor down to me to talk to me about it. And Dr. Larson says, no, you don't have to take the pain medicine if you don't want to. He says, but I imagine in a couple of days you're going to take it. So it's here if you need it. So on about the third day, he was right. It was out of this world. And it was so bad that at night, the daytime wasn't too bad because I had my books, and I had Star Trek, and I had Tom McHugh, and I had my visitors, and I could live with it. But at night, when I tried to sleep, I would go into this cold sweat, and it would completely saturate the bedclothes. And I'd ring the nurse, and she'd come down and change them. So on this one particular night, the nurse comes down about 4 in the morning, and she says, we've changed your bedclothes once tonight. We're not changing them anymore. You'll get them changed at 10 o'clock in the morning with everybody else. She says, now, if you want your pain medicine, I got it right here for you. And I said, I'm not going to take my pain medicine. She says, good night, Mr. Garlits. And so there I was. And I'm telling you, it was unbearable. I'm laying in an ice cold bed. It's wet. And my foot is just like you just taking an ice pick and just jobbing it in the thing. And I screamed out to God to help me. And he, in fact, did help me. He enveloped my body in his cocoon, and it was just like it was pure love. And that's why my cross says God is love, because I could just sense that love that he had for me. And he warmed me from that cold bed. He removed my pain. He gave me this feeling of well-being, of loved, of being wanted, of being cared for. And it's a feeling that you have to experience to understand where I'm coming from.
This physically took place? You actually physically felt this?
I physically felt this thing, and it was as though I was raised right up out of that bed without any medication or anything. And that was for all practical purposes, that was the end of the pain from that thing I went through, with the exception of the mornings when Mr. Larson, Dr. Larson, would come down to the hospital. There was 17 stainless steel stitches in my foot, and he'd cut them with some dikes and pull them out. And when he did that, I would actually feel that.
Well, that's going to do it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed. There's just so much here to see. And if you're in the Ocala area, I highly recommend that you pop in and take a tour. It is definitely worth the time, and bring a camera with some extra batteries. As always, stay positive, work hard, and make it happen.